Okay. We'll give it a minute and wait for a few more people to trickle in. Okay, well, it's just gone 7 o'clock. You guys ready to start?
Well, we should probably like make them make them wait a little bit longer, like 1 minute.
Yeah, we can do that. Sorry, I'm gonna try and stop all right, well, we can keep letting people in as they come in, but welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on Zoom tonight. We're so excited to be here and so happy that we're able to virtually convene to talk about this wonderful book and all of the wonderful themes that Sophie discusses. So I'm going to give a brief introduction, although I think that all of our panelists tonight may need no introduction, and then I'll hand it over to these guys. So Sofi Thanhauser teaches in the writing department at Pratt Institute. She has received fellowships and residencies at McDowell, UCross Foundation, and the Malay Colony for the Arts, and has contributed to The Establishment, Essay Daily, Wag's Review, The Spectator, White Hot Magazine of Contemporary Art, The Conversant, Entropy, Dilettante Army, and Edible Vineyard, among other publications. And her book, Worn, was released yesterday. Amanda Garfinkel is an assistant curator at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She specializes in contemporary fashion. Since joining the department in 2007, she has assisted on several exhibitions, including Alexander McQueen's Savage Beauty, Manus Ex Machina, Fashion in the Age of Technology, the Ray Kwakubo, Comme des Garçons, Art of the In-Between, Camp Notes on Fashion, About Time, Fashion and Duration, and In America, A Lexicon of Fashion. She holds an MA in Decorative Arts, Design, and Culture from Bard Graduate Center and a BFA in Crafts and Art History from Virginia Commonwealth University. Antoine Gregory is a fashion consultant and an editorial stylist based in New York. He is a graduate from New York's Fashion Institute of Technology with a background in fashion and art history. His dedication to the preservation and documentation of Black fashion, style, and culture led him to found the Black Fashion Fair in 2020. Black Fashion Fair is a platform dedicated to uplifting Black designers through commerce and education, and Blackness in fashion through photography, editorial, and film, highlighting Black designers as a meaningful part of the historical narrative and within context. Black Fashion Fair continues to advocate for greater access and visibility while making space for Black designers to contribute to the canon of fashion. Gregory has worked on special projects for brands such as Pierre Mas, Telfar, and continues to collaborate with emerging designers of color. Gregory serves as brand director for Theophilo. Rachel Tashin is the fashion critic at GQ, where she covers the runway, streetwear, and the luxury business. Previously, Tashin was the deputy editor at Garage Magazine and she's written for Art Forum, New York, and Vanity Fair. She's also the author of Opulent Tips, an invite-only newsletter about shopping. Tashin is based in New York City. And our wonderful moderator tonight is Rachel Syme, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she covers culture, style, city life, and entertainment. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Elle, Vogue, Book Forum, New Republic, GQ, and Vanity Fair. Rachel is currently writing a forthcoming nonfiction book entitled Magpie for Alfred A. Knopf. So I am going to hand over to these guys. Enjoy. Oh, and also everyone, a couple other things, sorry. There's going to be time for questions. So drop any questions you have in the Zoom chat, and we'll get to them later. And you can order a signed, personalized copy of Sofi's book through the McNally Jackson website. So I will drop a link. Definitely do that. Okay. Bye, enjoy.
Hi, everybody. And thank you for being here. And thank you to Sofi for writing this wonderful book, which came out yesterday, and I'm just holding up for everyone. Hopefully you get your hands on a copy soon. And I wanted to just start by throwing it to Sofi, because she is the guest of honor tonight, and ask about how this book came about for you. And yeah, what was the genesis of Worn?
Oh my God, I really have to get my story straight, because I feel like I've had a couple of interviews and everybody asks that and I have like no good answer. But basically, I think it came a little bit out of an interest in clothing and a kind of like contempt for clothing as well. In my college years, I was very like angry and I thought everybody looked like trash. And I thought like Iraq war was starting and the country was trash. And I was like really mad about a lot of things, and then slowly started to feel like they were connected to each other, essentially. And that sometimes things look bad because they are bad. And that if you dig into some of the histories and some of the present day realities of what's going on with our garments, and there is actually a lot to think about. And I majored in history. I've always like Anton was just saying before we started that he's a history nerd, and I kind of am too. And to me, writing about clothes was a way to write about a lot of things that I care about, like the history of women's labor in particular, and the history of like the kind of the colonial experience, like globally. Like both of those things to me were things I really wanted to think about in connection to one another. And clothing was basically a perfect vehicle to talk about those things at the same time, I think.
Yeah, and I before I throw it to the group, I have one more question for you, which is about the structure of this book, which I find so wonderful and novel, which is that you chose to structure through 5 materials and kind of weave, sorry to use the word, but the history throughout all these various textiles. And so I was wondering why that structure, why that choice?
Well, there's 2 answers and they're both true. And one of them, it was proposed by Laura Usselman, who's here in the crowd tonight. And I had thought about it, but I like a couple years before she suggested it, and I was like, no, it's too simple. It's too simple. And then I like ended up with this really like crazy manuscript that had a lot of history in it, but it wasn't really chronological. And the suggestion when she gave it to me and I like reassessed it, like actually made the book possible, because there's a lot of different stories in this book, and a structure like the one that we kind of came up with together is one that allowed me to focus for a little while on the story of women's labor, and then really focus for a little while on the British in India, and not have it have to go chronologically, but also not have it to be be little essays, which I also consider just a lot of disparate essays. And so it allowed there to be some chronology in the structure, but loose enough that you could go back and go forward and go back and go forward, and the reader wouldn't feel lost. So that was kind of how we came to that.
You had said you had talked to Antoine about being a fellow fashion history nerd. Antoine, I want to ask about how much history goes into your practice with fashion and how you engage with historical research archives and work.
I mean, I think it's more or less making up as far as like Black fashion fair, if I'm styling or doing like projects with like Black brands and Black designers, it's more about making up for the history that wasn't recorded and telling stories that way. So if I'm, like styling a project, I will probably reference like older photographers who probably like that most people wouldn't know of, like versus like someone like, like Gordon Parks, where like he's a very known photographer. So I try to look like for those niche type of people who like their stories never really got out. Like that's kind of where I am with that. It's like I want to tell like these untold stories. And I think that's like even why it's just like I like this type of reading with this book, because it was like super well researched, because you can like be like, I didn't know this, and now you can tell somebody else these stories. And that's kind of like where I am with like in fashion, where it's like, oh, I didn't know this, now I want to share this. And I try to like, even through editorial, just like reimagine concepts that we see every day in fashion, where Black people are often left out of. If I can put them into these spaces, that kind of changes the narrative, and it puts them in the same spaces like their white counterparts.
Yeah, and Amanda, how did you see that this book's engagement with history intersects with your own work as a curator? Because obviously that's all about sort of the historical background behind the pieces and trying to teach the public about the history of fashion.
Yeah, I mean, I learned so much from reading this book about the production of clothing. So often we're looking at the pieces that we include in exhibitions or we collect for the archive from a connoisseurial point of view. I'm particularly interested in the objects as objects, but I learned, yes, so much from this book about the history of the production of the objects. And I think in terms of untold stories, we are trying to do that now with the In America exhibition. The lexicon portion or part is open now, but the anthology part 2 of the exhibition opens in May. And one of our hopes for this exhibition was to tell, or to delve into the untold stories of these objects, American-made objects. So we're trying to do that. I think so much of this book is about the production and the politics of the making of clothes. That's in a way new to me, although we have tried to predict in our last exhibition and in this one what the future of at least American fashion will be. And I think that it overlaps in the focus on ethical production and methods of sustainability. We have a section in our latest exhibition, which is devoted to, the exhibition is about the emotional expressiveness of clothes. And we've devoted one section to consciousness, where we're focusing on objects that are made through reuse or recycling of materials. And I think that the designers in that section are connected in a real way to the issues that Sofi is explaining in her book. So we're engaging with these issues in the same way that I think her readers will, and she has over the period of her research. I think there are issues that we can't ignore any longer. And when we think about contemporary fashion, and when we think about the future of fashion, I think that, the ideas of where did these objects come from, where did the textiles come from, and what new practices can we put in place to sort of correct some of the destructive practices that we've used in the past is very important, and at least in contemporary fashion, in the study of contemporary fashion.
Well, and Rachel, I wanted to ask, as a critic, how often are you thinking lately about the political or ethical ramifications of designer, where they're sourcing things from, or sustainability? I mean, how has politics come to inform your work as a critic?
Well, I think people talk so much about fast fashion. That's kind of a big, I would say, a hot button issue in the fashion industry right now. What was interesting to me about reading about these issues, though, through the lens that Sofi took, is that it comes to all of these issues through materials. And we actually, in fashion, both in fashion criticism and fashion media more generally, that's sort of for a more like mass or consumer audience, we're mostly not talking about materials. We're mostly like looking at photographs. Like even when we're shopping, we don't go into the store and look at things. I mean, I remember like when I moved to New York, I would go to Barney's every weekend because I could never get into fashion shows. And I wasn't working for some place that was going to send me to Paris. And I would like flip over the, Alexander McQueen garments and like look at how these things were made. And I remember like picking up the Rei Kawakubo like super flat collection in the store and being like, whoa, it's pretty flat. They weren't getting I mean, this idea of like looking at first and foremost the materials, it's like it's not even what we consider, I think, as consumers. And it's not really what we think about as critics either. I mean, I've spent the past 2 years reviewing fashion shows remotely, and this book really underscored for me how much I must be missing from my analysis by not being able to look at these garments in this way. I also think I had a thought while I was reading that, part of, I wonder if there is like in this emphasis on the image, this emphasis on kind of digital fashion and the way that like Instagram is really driving high fashion and trends. And like even at this point, TikTok is doing the same. It encourages us to sort of gravitate away from the material and towards like these, I mean, the line that you have at the beginning about Jennifer Aniston's rayon shirt, I was like, ooh. Yeah, it does look so kind of limp, especially when you see it in the store. There can be that sort of like moment of surprise, like, wait a minute, I saw this like in InStyle and it looked so glamorous. But yeah, I mean, it was just, I think this is such, like, it was interesting. I felt like this emphasis on these 5 different materials, I think it will be an awakening for us in lots of different ways as like readers and also just like shoppers and thinkers.
Well,
I have to say that, sorry, Antoine.
Go ahead, Antoine.
We don't often look at clothes and understand like where they come from. Or like if you look at fast fashion, you may think of like, oh, someone's making this in a sweatshop. And like that's kind of like the only view you have of that. Or you see like a luxury brand show like some in-house people making something that they're actually not making. But you don't think about how there's real artistry behind a lot of these things. And I think when you walk through the different materials, or even if you walk through cotton, it was horrific how it came to be. And then now you can buy a t-shirt for $2, or you could buy a t-shirt for 50 cents if you buy enough of them from a vendor. So just like, you don't think about like the history of the actual fabric. And I think that's super important when you think about like, when you're going to buy stuff, because like fast fashion is not the only evil that we are experiencing in this industry. It's also like overconsumption. And it's like, if you spend time with like artisans, or like even if you go to Africa and you like understand like the kente cloth, and like we African people did not just come here to America to pick cotton, but in Africa, they were weavers, they were embroiderers, they're all these fabulous things. And those type of art, that type of like artisan work is like it's like being lost today because of like our need to like get things fast for fast fashion. But like we're going to miss a whole generation who knows how to do those things. Like even if you think about masonry, like stuff like that, like in like the home, like people don't know how to do like amazing carpentry work because everything is just mass produced and it's overconsumed. So we kind of like, we're going to, if we don't know these histories, like we're not gonna be able to like bring them forward. And I think that was like, for me, when I was reading, like we're gonna miss out on a lot of fabulous things. Like there's so much that goes into creating every single thing, especially if you give it time.
Yeah. I mean, Sophie, when you were working on this book, did you feel like you had an agenda? Like you wanted people to take something away about the way they shop or consume?
No, I didn't. I did have an agenda, and it was just to like get a whole lot off my chest. And it wasn't necessarily to tell people what to do, though. It was like I had been thinking about this for a while, and I had like I said, a lot of anger, and I had like slowly started to realize that so many of the stories that are in this book have been told, like the story of the US State Department in Japan, like setting up the textile industry, and then us like sacrificing our textile industry for a Cold War strategy. Like that's a crazy story to me that was just in this academic book that like not that many people have read because it's very like difficult to read book. I mean, and I was like, oh, I read the hard book, but it's like, it's not like it's not a popular book. Like it was some like, so I was like, this story belongs next to this other story about like the story of like cotton in the slave South and cotton in British India and cotton in Xinjiang. So it was, for me, I think my agenda was to make the work of scholars and researchers legible to people and put them together, because it bothered me that they weren't put together. And honestly, I was waiting for a while for somebody else to write this book because I kept thinking somebody should. I was like, somebody's got to write that book. And then like eventually I was like, I think I have to. But I don't want to tell people what to do, because I don't think I know any better than anybody else. Like, I wanted to illuminate some of these histories, and I wanted to make it as easy as possible to come to whatever, like sort of like Antoine was saying, like I learn a thing and then I want to pass it on. And to me, I really crave macro history. Like I want to understand 500 years. And I wasn't given that in school really. And I think it's really important to understand 500 years at once, not like every component of it, but I think there's political incentive to keep people to not understand 500 years. I think I don't know, I think the stuff that's been happening in the US in the last like couple of years has got people thinking about the last 500 years in a bigger way. And if we don't think about that, then we just cannot understand the world we're living in. Like the world we're living in doesn't make sense if you don't understand the history of slavery and the history of the colonial experience. Like it just literally doesn't make sense. Like why do we eat bananas like in North America? Nothing makes sense unless that history is part of, for me, my understanding of how, like, I remember being a kid and going to the grocery store and just thinking like, it's weird that I don't know where any of this food comes from.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, the pandemic has like taught me more about the supply chain than I've ever wanted to know in my life, but I feel like I never thought about it before, and now it's all we talk about and think about and see in our lives. But as your book sort of illustrated to me, these have been going concerns for, like you said, 500 years.
I think it really puts like an importance on like the history of the thing. Like whatever the thing is, whether it's fashion or not, you have to consider what that timeline is, what that history is. And I think this like really points that out in a really, really interesting way.
Yeah, I want to ask about the subject of sustainability. I know that news just came down that Kathy Hochul is considering this sustainability law that would make New York State the first sort of state that demands certain brands conform to certain rules about climate change and sustainability. But it's become such a buzzword in fashion in the last 10 years. But at the same time, I think when people hear that word, their eyes start to glaze over. They're not quite sure what it means. It's a little bit hard for people to grasp the concept. So I'd love to talk to you all about how you relate to that term now. Do you use it? Do you like to use it? Do you think about it? Does it come into your work regularly? What's your relationship to that idea? Whoever wants to go first is fine. Maybe Amanda?
Well, I mentioned it earlier. I think we've connected recently to ideas of sustainability in contemporary fashion in a couple of our recent exhibitions. In our last exhibition, we were looking at the last 150 years of fashion, and we ended with a gallery that was meant to be a coda to the show, which started in about 1870. Late 19th century, that in a way predicted the future of fashion. And I think it can go in lots of directions, but one of the most primary ideas is the idea of sustainability and of the ethical production of fashion, which I think Sophie calls for in this book, which is one major takeaway. So we focused on ideas of the handmade, of, in a way, pre-industrial production, which you, Sophie, talk about a lot in this book, or at least industrial production and the effect that has had on textile makers in the textile industry. Ideas of community in making, and the idea of reuse. And we visited that again in the new exhibition, which I said in the consciousness gallery of the show, A Lexicon of Fashion. And we focused on designers who are working with reused ideas or concepts or devices. Designers who are creating designs using recycled or reused materials. We focused on denim, which relates to the chapter on cotton in Sophie's book. And we focused on garments that retain their original shape and design, but are somehow altered by designers. And then we focused on a group of designers and designs that are made using either dead stock materials or materials not typically used for fashion, so upholstery materials or materials used from engineered fabrics that have a longer life. So we are just beginning to sort of dip our toes into that, as you say, the big complicated sustainability.
I mean,
issue.
Rachel, what do you feel like your responsibility is to talk about sustainability in your work?
Well, I think, fashion is completely irrational. It never makes any sense. And one of the most confusing things about it right now is that, younger generations, especially millennials and Gen Z, are very aware that, global warming is a really serious issue. And it's something that they're very concerned about. And yet they are addicted to fast fashion.
Yeah.
And so this is something that I'm like constantly trying to think about and wrap my head around. It does seem like, the most sort of effective way to deal with this is through legislation. But something that I've written quite a lot about as well is how can we maybe shift or broaden consumer tastes? I think one of the ways that this is already happening is through the interest in secondhand and vintage fashion, which is something that Sophie discusses as well. But, you've seen like this kind of explosive rise of the real, but also like all of these like, Instagram accounts that are selling vintage stuff. And in some cases, they're like not selling a ton of stuff. It's almost like someone's sort of pet project. It's the same with Depop, where people are being super creative with it. I mean, there's a woman I came across who's essentially like writing a novel through her Depop listings. She's writing a romance novel essentially. So I think that this is like kind of become a really creative space, an exciting space for people. That I think, maybe encourages us to think less about clothing as disposable and also more about the development of a sense of personal style, which I wrote a piece, I think it was a year or two ago, that was like unexpectedly to me, like one of our most popular GQ pieces about how developing personal style can be an act of sustainability, because if you know that what you really like and what really works for you, you're not having to get rid of things.
Thrashing around, buying a bunch of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, those things tend to be, as the book, outlines, like those things tend to be much better made, things that are vintage or secondhand. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of different things. I think it's like looking at the labor mispractices, looking at this as like an issue of exploited workforces, looking at it as an environmental issue, but then also trying to like, not putting the onus on the consumer necessarily, but like as individuals, what can we do aside from, wearing garments that are made out of plastic recycled bottles, which in many sort of environmentalists or fashion environmentalists would say is not necessarily sustainable.
Yeah.
Think about just like even like places like the Real and how often you can go on there and find things that are in store, 5 of them, just like you would at a regular store. So I feel like people think they're being sustainable, like, oh, I can buy this, but they immediately sell it. And then they immediately go purchase something else. So I think a lot of the onus is on a consumer. I think we are responsible mostly for what we consume and the ideas of like how we consume it. And I think, like you said, legislation would be the best way to like kind of remedy that, because I think consumers are still going to do what they want under the guise of like, oh, I'm being sustainable, or I'm like shopping on the railroad because it's pre-owned, but like it's 50 items of something you could also get in the store. and it'll be like new tag, like someone never even worn this, but they're selling it. So like those are like all things we also have to consider, like just what it looks like versus like what it is. And I think the fashion industry and it like does that all the time with every single thing, whether it's diversity or sustainability. It's not like a real thing that we've actually got any footing on.
Right. It's just sort of a buzzword that feels sort of like it keeps popping up, but what is the practice, you know?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you called your book, Sophia, People's History of Clothing, because what reading your book sort of made me think about was that there's these sort of three concepts swirling around that are all interrelated, but and sort of converge into the same thing, but that are different, which is like clothing, fashion, and style, which are like sort of in the same world, but there's different, and what I thought was really interesting was that you chose the word clothing, and I wanted to ask you about that. Like, it's not a people's history of fashion, it's not a people's history of style, it's a people's history of clothing, and I feel like that was a very purposeful choice on your part, and I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, I think it connects a little bit with this question of sustainability. Like I enjoyed hearing people talk about it, and I was glad I didn't have to go because I was like, I don't even know what I would say about this. But I was just thinking like clothing is a commodity. It's just a commodity. I mean, it's a lot more than that, but like, yeah, I think it's a history of clothing because I think the story of the labor story and the packaging, like the emotional, psychological, social, historical packaging all like goes into the commodity. And I love clothing, and I don't mean to say like it's just material, but it is material. And if you look at the material carefully, then it reveals like a very I don't know. I think it's important to take material seriously, like we've been saying, like the story of like the fall of this tariff wall and like the rise of China. It's all in the fabric. It's like all there already, and so I think a history of fashion and style. I don't know if you even need clothes to have style. Like you could probably do style without clothing, and fashion, you could probably do fashion without clothing, honestly. But
well, yeah.
I mean, yeah.
But I feel like go ahead, Andre.
It's a physical thing is what I was saying.
Yeah, and I wonder where sort of clothing and fashion intersect. Like I was maybe going to ask Rachel this because I feel like fashion is this world that's so, like you said, it's irrational, it's full of fantasy, it's full of, it's almost this like place of the mind, but then it's grounded in these actual things you can touch and feel. So for you, learning about the history of clothing, how does that inform your work on fashion,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an interesting question. I mean, I used to have a rule that I wouldn't write about anything that I hadn't seen in person. I had to suspend that rule over the past 2 years because I have always thought that it's really important to see the clothing in person and to feel it and know what it's really like. I mean, I went into the Comme des Garçons store for the first time in maybe a year and a half the other day, the one in Chelsea. And I was like, wow, I had just forgotten everything in there is cotton and muslin and wool. And that's what it is. And it's expensive. Well, Amanda can maybe speak to this better than I can, but like it's the endowment of the mind of the designer. The mind of the designer has given it much of its power. So I think that that's something that I think about a lot in my work. But it is also interesting to think about what designers are still using the cotton or using silk, using wool. Very often, like there aren't that many. So that's something interesting to think about.
I want to change roads just a little bit and ask each of our panelists sort of how these last few years of the pandemic have approached your feelings about getting dressed. I mean, not just in the style way, but just thinking about what you're wearing, where you're getting it from. I mean, has this last 2 years changed your mentality towards clothing at all? And maybe for Sophie, the question would expand to, has writing the book changed your mentality about getting dressed? Maybe Sophie, we'll start with you.
I'll start. The things that came to my mind is actually not about clothing. It was about lipstick. I remember like early on in the pandemic, this girl going by in a car and she like looked out and she had red lipstick on. I was so jealous and I couldn't figure out why, but it was because she had a car. So she had like a public space in which she could have her face showing. And I was on the street with my mask on. So there was like no way for me to wear lipstick in public, you know? And I was like, oh, that's so fun. Like, I don't even wear makeup that much, but I remembered how fun that is. And I think like the pleasure of being seen is a real pleasure. And especially in New York, I love checking people's outfits out. I love checking people's style out. And then also being checked out. Like that's a pleasure of the city to me. And I mean, it can happen obviously in the country too. Like a lot of my favorite outfits have been like outfits that I wear with like 2 other people there. Or, you know, like I also really like when somebody's outfit is like set up just for you, or just for like an audience of like 2 people and one of them is like 5 years old, you know, like that's to me like a good opportunity for dressing. But I don't think the pandemic has really changed the way I shop. And I don't think writing the book has either. Like I just get stuff in thrift stores. And then like if I get like a little more money, then I'll get something new, because I don't want to buy anything that's like less than $400. So it's like, I don't buy new stuff, but like the stuff I want is really expensive, you know? So it hasn't changed that much, but it has made me think a lot about what is so important to me about costume and like the drama of being part of the theater of civic space, because it really is important, I think, to my spirit. And I think it's important for all of us. And I think clothing is a really big part of that.
Andre, has these last 2 years changed your approach to styling at all?
Yeah, so I think because of just like the platform that I've created, that it's always been super important to me to wear Black designers. But I think because of like the eyes that are on me too, it's like important to mix them in ways that they feel as elevated as a Marni or a Balenciaga, like so to pair them together in those ways. And then like even I'm the brand director for The Affilio, and we create clothes. Basically, everything that we make is dead stock. So we use dead stock fabrics, and sometimes it's like fabrics like that isn't meant for clothing. So it's like we'll do a blazer and a boucle that's like from a couch that we have like some leftover fabric of, and like, that's been really cool. So like even just like coming up with new ways to just like experience Black designers and to experience like the ideas of sustainability and how we can continue to work that into like our everyday wardrobe.
Yeah. And I mean, Amanda, I remember you had to stage this exhibition like during the pandemic. I feel like the gala got pushed twice. And then I think when I went to see the exhibition, it was the first time I'd been to the Met since the pandemic.
Yeah.
Have you felt like that affected your approach at all, having to push it into the future so much?
You know what? We did have to push the About Time exhibition from May to an October, gosh, is it 2020 opening? But we, oddly enough, our work in the museum has been moving forward pretty much on track since then. The museum's been open for a long time, and they've managed to make that work with limits on capacity and limits in galleries. So it hasn't affected me and us in our work so much, except we are often working from home, which we haven't done before. And I know we've all talked about this so much, but in terms of my own style, which was one of the initial questions, I am the opposite. I'm notoriously a uniform person. I love clothes, I love objects, but I wear the same, some variation of the same 3 or 4 things all the time. And that hasn't changed. I think it's only gotten worse since the pandemic started. In fact, I like hiding behind the mask, in all honesty. But interesting, Antoine, to hear about the Affilio and the dead stock fabrics and the non-fashion fabrics. It's really fascinating. And I'm curious, maybe for later in the conversation, how you source those materials if you're making that effort. It's been so interesting to hear from some of the designers that we've worked with in the exhibition, you know, where do they go? How are they making this? How are they making it work?
Well, we typically will go to like a fabric house and ask for like anything that's dead stock, anything that you have like remnants of that you really can't use. So like we'll end up making a top that we can only make 3 of, and it's barely a size run. Or we'll go to a fabric like for like even just like for textiles, we'll do the same thing. And Evan will like go through what they have and like see where they align with color wise. But it's like if you ask, you will receive it. And I think that's kind of like how we just been able to do that. We don't really source like we don't try to source like new fabrics because we try to, like I said, Evan's whole thing is like sustainability. We work with all manufacturers in New York, from embroiderers to the people who actually put the clothes together, like the factory workers, like everything's made in New York. So like that's another way. So we're not like adding to like the carbon footprint of like shipping to China and then becoming like shipping it to America. We don't do any of that. Everything's made in New York. And that's for us to support the local communities. That's for us to be like supporting. We use this woman, Amy, in the garment district all the time, like to support those really small businesses who like can use that. And like we share like the same sort of like Rag and Bone, Marc Jacobs, like so a lot of these brands are producing stuff in New York. And I think that's like one of the best ways that we could be sustainable by not like outsourcing our production to another country, even though it would save us a lot of money.
Yeah, I think it's also great how it gets closer to the house, how it's more local. But I also think it introduces a new kind of creativity to fashion, you know, this challenge of working with dead stock fabrics and the reuse of fabrics or the reuse of garments. I see a lot of artistry and creativity there.
For sure.
Yeah, and in terms of creativity, Antoine, like, have you felt like being on a digital platform or having your styles seen? Like when Rachel was talking about not being able to write about anything she can't see, I mean, but then we're doing everything virtually now. Have you felt like that's had to push your creativity in new directions in terms of styling?
Yeah, I think you definitely have to consider that people are not seeing this in real life. So how can you make these items, these photos, whatever it is, more visually impactful? And I think that's like, for me, it's just like, how can I add like interest anywhere? It's like just visually, whether it's like, I do this thing where like, I'll do like, if I'm styling, like it'll be like a big earring and a little earring. So you have to notice it. You have to see it. And I think that's like been really fun for me to like just do these little things that people like, it feels like it's not organic. So like you like it catches your eye. Like, oh, what's that? So like that's where I've been with my styling, with like my imagery. So
Yeah, and Rachel, you started Opulent Tips during the pandemic, and I feel like you had this very eye has to travel attitude towards that. I mean, what was the impulse for starting a sort of dispatch about shopping when nobody can really go to stores that much?
Well, funnily enough, I like was really what Sophie was saying at the very beginning of our conversation was really resonating with me, that everything is like garbage. And, you know, just I look at Instagram a lot, both for work and for pleasure. And I'm sure many of you get these ads for these like terrible looking sheet brands and, you know, cashmere brands that you're sort of like, why is this cashmere sweater like $100? That doesn't really make any sense. And things like that really, really bother me. First, just as an aesthetic person, I found it just abominable. But also it's just waste. It's complete waste. And often it's like done in this pursuit of quote unquote good taste. Like, oh, everyone should have nice sheets, or everyone should have, you know, cool looking furniture, which they should, but it shouldn't be made in this totally, you know, horrible, like shoddy, bad craftsmanship way. So a lot of it was kind of in response to that. I think the other thing too is that, you know, a lot of women's fashion is very focused on the same handful, like kind of core of designers. And especially when I was, early in the pandemic and was doing a lot of having like really raw conversations, as I'm sure Antoine did too, with designers about their financial situations. And these are people who are super creative, who were just like, I hope I sell a sweater this season. I really wanted to sort of find a way to spotlight some of those people, who I think are making really beautiful clothing, some of which is expensive, some of which is not, but which is worth the money. And also to point out, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, the availability of vintage design that's very often like better made and a lot more fun than things that are new. So that was kind of the impetus. Yeah.
So we have some good questions from the audience, so I just want to pose them to all of you. Maybe we'll just start for one for Sophie because woman of the hour, but Christina asks, can you say a little bit about your research process and how long it took you to research the information? Did you travel to the sites of production, and what surprised you the most in the process of researching this book?
Thanks for the question. It took a long time. I worked on this book for about 10 years, and I didn't realize it was going to take that long. I probably wouldn't have started if I had known, but that is about how long it took. And I did travel a lot. I traveled to India and China and Vietnam and Honduras and Texas. And I did go to a lot of factories and a lot of cotton farms. And I spent a lot of time in cars with men and factories with men, a lot of men. I was like, why am I always hanging out with men? And I was like, oh, because men own all this stuff, like pretty much. But the factories were full of women. So it's like, I saw a lot of women working and I felt like a dick, like just watching them work, there's nothing worse than watching people work, like, oh, here I am to watch you work. But I guess one thing that surprised me was, I think maybe I thought like I was going to find like the evil person, like, oh, this is a bad dude or this is a bad person. And it's not, it's just a bunch of regular people like trying to make their life work. So, I mean, I love these two questions that are next to each other about like socioeconomic stuff and like accessibility. And I love the pairing of those two questions because that's the paradox, I think. Like that is exactly the paradox.
Well, let's bring those questions up for the group, which is this. Catherine asked, what is the people on the panel? I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on accessibility of sustainable clothes among differing socioeconomic classes, and how do we get better options to everybody? I don't know who wants to go first. Antoine, Amanda, do you have any feelings about this question of how sustainability can be something that's widely accessible?
I'm a little late to the game, but I just started using the RealReal over the pandemic and have been surprised by the decent prices for pieces that I've seen in stores before the pandemic that I sort of wished I could own, but were too expensive. So I think that's a step in the right direction. I mean, Depop is the same. You can find really good used and vintage pieces for a really decent price on these sort of online clearinghouses. I think that's democratized fashion in a way. I think, and also as I was saying before, that the challenge of sustainability is also sort of introduced a new kind of creativity to fashion. And I think, as Rachel was saying about developing your own personal style, having to go out there and sort of search rather than have that sort of presented to you as part of a store's inventory or sort of aesthetic is also something you can do if you're feeling creative for not a whole lot of money. It takes time though, and time, is something we don't all have.
I mean, I think the best way to be sustainable at any economic level is to buy less. And
Mhm.
that's like all the time, because like I'm by no means, I'm not rich, but I'll save up and buy a $700 sweater because I saved up and I didn't waste money buying 20 H&M sweaters. I just said, I want this sweater, I'm gonna buy it. So I ended up buying less. It cost me more probably, but I got the one item that I'm probably going to have forever. Everyone doesn't need a $2,000 jacket. You can get one for less, but if that is a jacket you want, you shouldn't buy 8 jackets on the way up to that one. So I think buying less, buying smarter, buying better, that would be like the best way to be sustainable. And you can do that at any price point, really.
Yeah. And this question is also for all of you, but I wonder, as Rachel said, she made an argument about sustainability growing out of developing a sense of personal style. And Antoine, you're talking about how you're saving up for a $700 sweater because you know that fits into your own aesthetic. And I'm wondering how all of you go about developing, what your tips would be for people listening in today that might want to work on developing their personal style, because I think that is the main thing that puzzles people. I mean, so many people just see something on Instagram and it looks great and okay, they click, they bought it. But how would you all recommend that people really understand themselves and develop a unique aesthetic that would lead to this desire to save up for, say, a $700 sweater?
You have to go to stores. You have to go to the stores. You have to try on the clothes. You have to talk to the people in the stores. You have to like build a relationship with a brand. I have a very small selection of brands that I have my go-to brands. I've tried them on, I went in store. So I can shop those brands online now because I have developed a relationship with them outside of online. And I think obviously in a pandemic, that's a lot tougher to do, but it's much harder to continue to send stuff to your house, try it on, not like it because you didn't get the right fit. So you probably would have liked it if you would have got the fit right. Most people don't know what size they are. They don't know the fit, and most retailers don't know how things fit either. So you have to go there, try on multiple sizes, and really understand your body. Once you understand your body, that's like the biggest like tip that you can have, like understanding what fits you, what's your body type, and then just like I think you have to try the clothes. You have to try on multiple sizes. You can't, a 27 in Balenciaga might be different from a 27 in Levi's. Like you have to try these things on. You have to have those experiences.
Yeah, and Rachel, how do you say people should develop a personal style, especially when it comes to buying less things? Because I think a lot of people, one of the sort of most alluring things about fast fashion for a lot of people is this idea that you could go on and try a bunch of personalities for not that much money. So how do you think people can develop without necessarily diving into the fast fashion market?
Well, one of the things that I really I really learned to fall in love with when I first moved to New York was going shopping, which doesn't necessarily mean buying things. I think walking to a neighborhood or taking the subway to a neighborhood and just going in every store, even if it's like not a store that you necessarily ever pictured yourself buying from, but just experiencing and trying to figure out what is it that this brand or designer is trying to say, like what kind of clothing do they make, who else is here, how do I feel in this place. It's just a really fun anthropological experience, and it's part of what I think that those sorts of experiences are part of what makes it so wonderful to live in New York or to live in a city. And of course, it's not just in large cities where there are wonderful stores. I was just emailing with a friend of mine who's going to Santa Fe, which has like some of the best shopping in the world. Yeah, and I do think a part of that is, as Antoine is saying, like trying things on, even if you're not planning to buy anything. And I think, I realized it can be really uncomfortable to try something on and then sort of say to the salesperson, I'm not going to buy this. But I think learning to sort of have that experience is really important. And yeah, I also like, this is such a nerdy thing, but Rachel, when you first started asking this question, I was like, we almost read more biographies. But I do think it's, there's such a, in biographies, but also in literature, maybe before 1960, there's so many more details about what people are wearing, like in The Razor's Edge, one of the big sort of points of contention between the anti-hero and his betrothed is that she keeps shopping at Chanel, and he finds that really deplorable. So, which is something that you would never see in a book now, I don't think, in a novel now anyways. or not any that I've unfortunately come across. But yeah, I think just having that sort of like this sort of cultural enrichment, that always is going to inform the way that you dress, and or at least
Yeah.
it should.
I mean, Sophie, you said when you wrote this book, you had no agenda and you didn't want people necessarily to feel like you had a didactic idea of how they should change their behavior. But I mean, do you feel like after people read Worn, is one of the results will be that they change their philosophy towards shopping or style in any significant way?
I mean, I would hope so. Yeah, I would hope that people can approach the process of encountering clothing with like a lot more information and interest. And I just want to say to Claude in the comments, it's such a good point, like about stagnating wages. Like, I do think one thing I worry about, like I remember when Michael Pollan's book, Omnivore's Dilemma came out, and it was like, oh my gosh, like there's bad food and then there's good food, and like we got to get the good food that's like more expensive, and then it just becomes like a class issue because like everybody needs to eat still, and like most people in America are not making like a lot of money, and most people in the world are not making a lot of money because that's how like capitalism works. So as long as we have like people who have, I think like cheap goods like keeps this whole machine going, like it's like, well, I don't make good money, but I can buy a lot of shit and that feels good. And I don't want to tell people like, don't get that good feeling. Like, you know what I mean? So I guess I would hope that people get some ideas, or maybe they like, I think one of my favorite things in reading a book is when a writer says something and I think like, I knew that already. Like I already knew that, but I didn't say, I don't know. I would hope that I could awaken some intuitions that people had already had about how they approach clothing and what it is, and then maybe allow them to like have the space to think that through a little bit. And I don't know, maybe like play around a little.
Yeah, and did it change the way you shopped personally? That's what Jacqueline wanted to know in the comments.
Not particularly, but I will say that like I've been working up the courage for the last, I've had the desire for like at least a decade to have like a suit tailored to me, just like a tailored suit. And I think I'm getting closer to the point where like Antoine said, like that is the only thing that I want. Like that is all I want, because I want something that is made for me, like to my body by somebody who's like measured it. And so I don't know, I think I'm working my way towards like being really clear on that desire, that that's what I want in my clothes, is like somebody made them for my body, which is like probably a whole nother level of expensive, but that's what I'm working up to.
Amanda, what about you? Has this change, like reading this book, did it change the way you think you're going to approach exhibitions, or did it sort of shift anything in your mind?
I think, there's a lot of hard information in this book. So I think it did make me reflect on the way I consume fashion, which has slowed in a major way since the pandemic. But it just reminds me how conscious I need to be about, where my clothes come from and what I buy. As Antoine said, maybe better to invest in something that will last longer, which I try to do in general. In terms of our exhibitions, I think, we do exhibitions every year, which is somewhat unusual for curatorial departments in the museum. And they usually involve some sort of elaborate design build out. At the end of the show, we're becoming more conscious of, and this isn't about fashion necessarily, but it's about materials, whether we can reuse the materials somehow in other places in the museum. And of course, we're being, because it's become such a huge part of fashion now, much more aware of sustainability in general. But I think reading this book, or what's so good about this book is that it's very dense and it's full of a lot of good history, as Antoine was saying, and a lot of good information about the production of fashion, but it moves really quickly and it's very easy to read. It's taught me a lot about not only the production of fashion and textiles in the last 20 years, but as Sophie was saying, in the last 500 years. And it seems like we repeat a lot of the same patterns, which is a little bit dispiriting. I don't know, as she said in the end, how we find our way out of this pattern, but I'm certainly more conscious of the destruction that the textile industry causes and the fashion industry causes. And I just feel like as a result of reading it that I need to be more conscious and more aware.
I'm going to take a few more questions for individual people on the panel. And then if you have any last questions, I ask people to drop them in the chat because we're coming to the end. But this is a question directly for Antoine from Layla, who said, what are your strategies for researching fashion history, which has been largely erased or underpreserved? And have you found success in searching through less traditional archives? Oh, you're muted.
So in terms of, I think, regular fashion history, that's much easier to find. I think for me, it's about Black fashion history. And that's like searching through the archives at like FIT, like through old magazines. But I've been very fortunate enough to have developed like real relationships with a lot of designers, both past and present, to where I can speak to them directly. And I'm, so like, it's more of a oral history in a sense that I have. So I'm able to speak to them directly, or like to have them show me their own personal stuff, because like a lot of libraries didn't keep this. A lot of museums did not archive Black designers' work, and I think that's the part that's the most frustrating, that it's so difficult to find. And if I didn't have like certain relationships with like Kirby from Pierre Moss, like where I can have direct access to his couture collection, like that wouldn't be a thing. And if one magazine, I think, shot a piece with Zendaya on it from his couture collection, and then just very recently, he was on the cover, I think, of another magazine where they shot some pieces. But it's a thing where it's like Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, like they didn't pull his stuff for their shoots. So it's just like, even currently, it's hard to find the work of Black designers. So I have to personally like get imagery, put Black photographers together to shoot this and archive it. And I think with our fashion stories on blackfashionfair.org, we've been able to do that. And next month we have some really great stuff coming out where it's like, we've documented so many Black designer collections in a way that's never been done before. I have to almost be the one, or be the institution that preserves our work, or preserves the work of Black designers and Black culture and Black style, because I can look through all the magazines I want. It does not exist.
You're becoming the archive yourself, or building it yourself.
We're the repository for Black fashion, style, and culture.
Right. And I mean, Sophie, I mean, this kind of relates to the project of your book in general, because I think so much of what you put in this was just completely unwritten history. I mean, yes, it's synthetic work of pulling from various sources that you were able to find, but I mean, how much of it to you was just kind of filling in the gaps of, as Antoine said, oral history where things didn't exist in the sort of lineage of these 5 textiles?
I was just thinking about that as Antoine was talking about oral history, because of how many people I talk to, like, who have experience with, say, industrial equipment that is no longer used, that might even be like in the junkyard now. There are people working on preserving some of these cool old American like textile machines, but there's not a lot of institutional support for saving them. And like, so many of the people that I spoke to told me things that their livelihood is in the world of like material production, and that doesn't mean they're not like very good with words, because a lot of them were like farmers and industrialists and like craftspeople, but they don't write down what they're doing, and often a lot of it is lost. So I think it was really gratifying to me to like get to put down on tape and then on paper some of the language of people who have like a real depth of knowledge that they developed in the course of their working lives, and may have also like inherited from a parent or like a colleague, that there isn't like a textbook for. anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, fashion history already is such an underdeveloped area. I mean, there's people that have been working in it, but like this is a real work of scholarship and a real addition to the field. And I'm really grateful that you have written it. But I want to sort of leave everybody with this last question since we're running up against time, which is just, I'm assuming everybody that's tuned in tonight is really interested in fashion and has a sort of a interest in the material and where their clothes come from. And I just wonder, for all of their panelists, what are you all thinking about? Like, what's your big sort of fashion or clothing idea for 2022 that's sort of been possessing you lately? What is on your, not only your sort of like vision board and your fantasy board, but just sort of politically, what are you thinking about as we move into 2022? Maybe we'll start with Rachel.
A colleague of mine, Noah Johnson, wrote a piece last fall for GQ's website about how he was committing himself to wearing only clothing made by people whom he personally knew. And what's been interesting about that for him is that, you know, he knows, for example, someone who works at Dover Street Market and on the weekends makes really cool wool hats, and he only makes like 2 of them a month or something. So, you know, not very many of them a year, but then also he is very close friends with a designer named Evan Canori, who is a great menswear designer who works with, you know, a lot of very simple but beautifully cut fabrics. And I've gotten really attached to that idea myself, which in some ways has meant that, you know, I just will email or DM a designer and say I really like them and want to be friends with them. But I found that to be really rewarding. And in some ways, that's also kind of opened my style in some really funny ways. Like the 2 sweaters that I'm wearing right now are made by a designer named Lauren Manoogian, who works in New York and makes really beautiful knitwear. But I've also become very friendly with the designer Maureen Sayre, who is an upcycling pioneer and makes what she calls future wear, which looks incredibly sci-fi and couldn't be more different from this. But those are like my 2 primary modes. So that's, I guess, been my sort of goal for 2022.
Amanda, what's on your 2022 radar?
American fashion is on my 2022 radar. I've been immersed in it for about a year, but it's only sort of a little fire for me. I'm very interested in researching contemporary American designers and discovering new American designers. I think there's a lot of incredible creativity right here near us, that we know there's so much abroad. Yeah, American designers for me. And you know, also not just contemporary, but also researching designers, American designers that are no longer working. So designers in our collection. So I've sort of made a commitment to myself to delve into American design in 2022.
And when is the second part of the exhibition going to debut?
So the next part of the exhibition, we're rotating the lexicon exhibition in March, which was always a plan, but the second part opens in May and both will be open through September. And the second part will be installations of early 20th century and 19th century clothes in the American Wing period rooms, which will be, you know, very different from lexicon, but more connected to untold stories, which I think makes a lot of sense in this conversation.
Yeah. And Anton, what's your 2022 fashion vibe? What are you getting into?
Well, for me, obviously, I love shopping Black designers, but to keep that going, and I love still emerging designers like Emily Bodie. I think she's great, and like she's pretty sustainable. But just definitely championing Black designers, and just doing some work. We have some really great stuff coming out in 4 days, that really puts Black designers into just a different space, to the space I think they should have always been a part of, but just continuing the work that I do, but through fashion, obviously, and just keeping that support going. I don't know. It's so much.
Yeah, and you dropped in the chat the email address, but do you want to do a little plug?
So yeah, Layla just asked if we had like any like opportunities. So I didn't realize that it was a direct message. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay.
I responded
I'm
to
sorry.
everyone.
I thought you were trying to do a mass plug. I was going to give you
Oh
an
no,
opportunity to promote.
it was action.
No worries. Okay, and then maybe we'll end with Sophie. Thank you all for being here tonight. And yeah, I'm very overwhelmed as a moderator, but you guys were amazing. And I want to ask Sophie, sort of, as you put this book out into the world, how are you approaching clothing in 2022, and what is your sort of feeling about the future of fashion as this book enters the world?
Ooh, well, I want to share a fun fact first of all, which is that I used to live with, I didn't live with Lauren Manoogian, but I lived with this guy named Johnny Corndog, who was her boyfriend, and she was always around, and I always thought she was a lot cooler than him. Yeah, he was like a musician, and he was like the hotshot of the relationship, and she was just like quietly going about like doing secret stuff. And then like 10 years later, I was like, oh, she's way more famous than him now. And I really love her clothes as well. Like those are nice. Like I said, I have this fantasy of the tailored suit, and I have an ongoing, like, I have a love-hate relationship with knitting. I think like it might be my year. It might not be, but it might be the year that I start knitting. We'll see. I've been weaving a little bit, but knitting is
Do you have
like
a loom?
a lot more relaxing. I do. I have a little loom, just like a simple tapestry loom, not like a heddle loom, that has been coming in handy lately just to like calm me down a little bit. And but I was thinking knitting might be even better because it's so portable and it's very like soothing to do.
Well, if you knit something, Rachel can have it because you'll be someone she knows.
I think that is a
See?
I think that is a very cool project. I think that is a really cool idea to just get clothes from people you know. I think that's awesome. I love that idea.
No,
Yeah,
I'm
and
very fortunate. I would say I'm very fortunate to be a part of a brand that it's like excellent. Where Edvin, I love these pants. Can you make them for me? And then in 3 days, I have a lovely pair of Theophilio pants that are just for me.
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, I think this book has really changed the way that I look at the history. Like you said, Sophie, so interesting. The five that macro history of clothes, and that every object that you touch or look at has this whole story behind it. And I love that we have this volume for people to read. So thank you for writing it. And I think it's going to, yeah. But I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. Does anyone have anything they want to add or say to Sophie or otherwise?
I just want to say thanks for the audience for being here. And there's so many people that have really encouraged me over the course of writing this book and have like really like made this book possible just by like in big and small ways by encouraging me. I just want to thank you guys. And thank you for the people encouraging me to learn knitting in the comments, and shout out to the people who are knitting while they watch this.
Yes, and you can order a signed copy of Worn, which I am going to again hold up as like a sort of Vanna White move. And from McNally Jackson's website, and Sophie will have signed it. And thank you again for everybody. I am so honored to be moderating with all these fashion luminaries that we have. This is the future. So thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for
Take it away,
coming
Michaela.
out, for moderating. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much everyone for coming out. And yes, definitely buy the book. And these always end very, very abruptly. So I apologize in advance. I'm gonna do that now. Thank you again, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank
And
you.
congratulations, Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.